So by doing these studies, we can actually see if we can identify a particular event, and then the next idea is we then look at that event and say, well, what are the processes involved? How did it occur? What triggered it? What did it behave like? Did it impact onto communities, onto hydropower stations? Could we have foreseen its occurrence? So this really enables us to start to understand how that catchment behaves. Okay, next slide, please. But another critical thing is a lot of people then sort of think about going to these catchments and think, well, let's just think about what is there now. But what is important is what is there now has been preconditioned by millions of years of geological processes. Plate tectonics, the fact that India is driving north into Eurasia at about 45 centimeters in the south of the Himalayas, slowing to about 20, not centimeters, millimeters, to about 25 millimeters north into the Tibetan Plateau. It's compressing, and that compression causes the geological fabric, which is largely east-west. Most of the mountain chains are east-west, but there are areas where there are fractures through north-south, and that's where the rivers tend to go in the north-south. So those draining from Tibet tend to follow fault systems. Well, if you have fault systems, it means you're fracturing the rock. Well, if you fracture the rock, you're likely to have an instability. And if you have instability, you're going to have landslides. So suddenly you start to see that the plate tectonics and the faulting leads to structures, which leads to landslides, which can lead to landslide dams, which can lead to impoundment of rivers, and that can lead to floods. So you start to see that starting with the plate tectonics, you end up with floods. So you start to see now the interlinkage between them. And then as a consequence of that, you can then start to understand why are there clusters of landslides where there are. If you go to the Botakoshi, for example, and look along that valley, I mapped out the reason the valley is there is because it's faulted on both sides. And because it's faulted on both sides, the east-facing side of the valley is particularly prone to large landslides. And these have been in place for hundreds of years. Okay, so what, you might say? But when the conditions are right, be it an earthquake and or the monsoon, parts of these landslides can be reactivated. And the reactivation is impacting actually on the main Arnico highway. And it's actually disrupting it. And it's not just disrupting it a little bit. In a single season, a pre-monsoon season, chunks of that road literally subsided by 15 meters. Other parts of the road were ruptured and actually taken out by the instability of the hillsides. And so looking at these, the relationship between the faulting, the landslides, the flows that generate from the landslides, you can understand then how dynamic this environment is. And that's one of the reasons why the Botakoshi hydropower project had the issues that it did. So looking at landslides, it's not just enough just to say, oh, there's a landslide, thank you very much. Oh, there's another landslide, thank you very much. It's a question of saying, why is there a landslide there? And is it related to that landslide over there? And is it related to that cliff face that I can see over there? What does that tell me? And when you put all that together, you suddenly realize that you're not just looking at a small problem here. You're actually looking at a much larger pattern of events within that catchment. Next slide, please. And of course, the high Himalayas are glaciarized, and you all be familiar with glacial lake outburst floods. And one of the critical things about those is the fact that I'm sorry to say that most of the glacial lake outburst flood studies that have done, in my opinion, are wrong or misleading. There is an overstatement about the degree of hazard associated with glacial lakes. That's not to minimize the significance of them by any means, but you need to put into a context why the lakes are there, how these relatively stable lakes in the main can be destabilized by external processes, cloud bursts, by thawing permafrost because of increasing temperatures, because of global warming, and landslides and ice avalanches. And these can destabilize the water mass. The water mass then sloshes backwards and forwards like it does in a bath, and then the waves propagate downstream, and that generates the floods. And I'll just give you an example on the graph on the right-hand side. There is I won't go into detail here, but there are ways you can use multi-criteria analysis to actually prioritize or assess the degree of hazard posed by any lake. So when people say, oh, we have no idea how dangerous the lakes are or how hazardous they are, there is a way of determining it, objectively, not subjectively. There are studies that have done, and they come out with a phrase to say that glacial lakes are potentially dangerous. No, they're not. Some are, but only the minority. The question is, which ones? And by doing this particular analysis in an objective way, you can, for a whole region, prioritize or assess their relative degree of hazard posed. So you can assess which ones we need to concentrate on and which ones we don't. And that means that for organizations like the Department of Hydrology and Meteorology, rather than having to try and do all of the lakes in a region, they can just concentrate on a few and do that properly. So that's a reasonable way of focusing. And on the bottom the row here, we have what I was alluding to before, which is sediment management. And typically when you talk to a hydropower engineer about sediment management, you're talking about grain size of less than 0.2 millimeters in terms of the effect of that in terms of corrosion on the turbine blades. That's why you have desilting basins, to get rid of that. But I look at what happens in the Boticosi, and you see these huge blocks of material which were rammed into the radial gates that jammed them so they couldn't function, and that then triggered a whole series of subordinate processes that ultimately led to its destruction. So when people say that we're managing sediment, I always say, what sediment? How big is the sediment? Where is the sediment coming from? And how are you actually dealing with it? Because this is absolutely critical to a hydropower, successful hydropower. Next slide, please. So just going through this, I just want to give you an idea about, well, you're not technical people in some, like I am as a geoscientist, but I want to show you why you should be interested in this and why it matters to you. If we first look at this infographic, we see that on the top left we have hydropower developers. They should have an interest in integrated geohazard assessments because it can help build the resilience of their scheme. That's the first benefit. In the middle there we have the funders like international development banks, or for smaller projects, local banks. You want to do your due diligence. Is your project going to be there in 5 years' time? Is it going to be there in 10 years' time or 20 years' time? If you're investing and taking the risk on $500 million of investment, you need to do your due diligence. So your financial advisors should be doing their due diligence to look at the geohazard assessments. Is it going to be a safe investment? And then looking on the right-hand side, we then notice the box on the insurance industry or the insurance companies. You need to understand the degree of hazard posed because you need to assess the risks. And I'm not an insurance specialist, so if I get my terminology wrong, please forgive me. But basically, having worked on a few insurance claims, one of the things that I've seen to have observed, let's put it that way, there seems to be a mismatch between what the insurance companies are offering as products, what the developers need, and what ultimately is achieved. And often what the result is not necessarily appropriate for that particular environment, in my opinion as a geoscientist. Because I can think sometimes the insurance products are too blunt an instrument or don't recognize the fact that these geological processes are not just a single event. It's not just a GLOF, it's not just an earthquake, it's a combined thing. So if you have a sublimit in your insurance policy so that if the event is, let's say, a GLOF, you pay for that. But what happens if the GLOF is caused by a cloudburst that also occurs at the same time as an earthquake? You then can start to see that the unraveling of the insurance claim is going to get more and more complicated. And the main beneficiaries of those tend to be the lawyers. And so one of the things we need to make sure is that the insurance industry understands the environment better. The developers know what to ask for to make sure they're being properly insured, because otherwise you can end up with an insurance gap. So what part of your scheme actually is not covered by insurance? And it might catch people out. Next slide, please. So just to go through the summarising this, the first thing we have to recognise is that climate is changing. And as a consequence of changing climate, the extreme events are becoming more extreme. We're finding that they're occurring more frequently. And as a consequence of that, the impacts are becoming more pronounced. And the other reason that they're becoming is that with these processes and with climate change, there is also accompanying that growth in society, development. And that increases the risk because more infrastructure becomes vulnerable. As I mentioned about insurance policies involving sublimits, I would love to learn from those of you in the insurance industry and your comments on the suitability of insurance policies and how you determine your risk associated with that. So I'm here to learn from you, not to try and influence from my side. But the important thing is an integrated geohazard assessment can help to identify the range of scenarios of processes within a catchment to try and reduce the uncertainty of what might befall your scheme over time as a consequence of hydropower. And so, an insurance company here, unfortunately I can't remember who, actually said some years ago to me, after I gave a talk about integrated geohazard assessments, if a developer were to do a comprehensive one, it has to be done properly, then the insurers might be prepared to reduce the annual insurance premium to recognise that the fact that the risk has been identified. And if you identify the risk and you build that into your disaster risk management strategy, you are demonstrating the fact that you are being serious and taking responsibility for your own system, rather than just saying, hey, just the insurance company will pay out, I don't need to worry, I can just do what I normally do and the insurance people will pick up the tab if anything goes wrong. That's not good for anybody. I'm trying to help people to be more responsible and saying, if I can help reduce my vulnerability and you can reflect that, maybe I can get a financial incentive by a reduced insurance premium. Now, I can't speak on behalf of the insurance companies as to whether you'll be willing or not to do that, but bearing in mind that was told to me by an insurance company, I think that's a fair statement to make. But I think the other thing to say is that you need to have more relevant insurance policies, appropriate for the environment that the development of the projects that exist. If you go on to the next slide, please. So effectively, we have to understand that integrated geohazards should be carried out for all hydropower projects. Now, you might say, well, mine's already built, therefore it's irrelevant. No, because probably when it was designed, could have been 20 years ago. The climate has changed significantly in the last 20 years. And therefore we have to make sure that our schemes are fit not just for 20 years ago, but for 20 years in the future and beyond. So how do we do that? Well, we look at the integrated geohazard assessments. We then assess whether or not the hydropower scheme in its current situation is fit for purpose. And then we start thinking about, can we retrofit? Can we do any other mitigation works? And so on and so forth to reduce resilience. But just thinking, well, I built it in 1970, and because of that, I'm going to stick with that in perpetuity. That to a certain extent means your scheme may become vulnerable because it is no longer fit for the state of the environment in 20 years' time or whatever it happens to be. So by identifying the possible scenarios, you really are trying to assess the different types of things that could impact onto your scheme. But remember that we're no longer talking about discrete processes. We're talking about multiple processes that can occur concurrently or sequentially, that can build and develop and cascade, so that by the time an event hits a hydropower scheme, it is much larger than what started out. Because you can start out with maybe a landslide upstream in a rainstorm, and then all of the effects of the rain in the tributaries, plus a landslide dam, an outburst from that, debris flows that arise as a consequence, and so on and so forth. But that's all going to hit your hydropower scheme, not just a single element of it. So by identifying the natural hazards, you can positively influence the resilience of your scheme. You can protect your investment. You can make sure your insurance risk is well managed. But it requires a partnership, if that's not too strong a word. And I hope there are no lawyers, well, perhaps there are lawyers here. I'm not saying a legal partnership, but there is teamwork to be had so that you all benefit. I'm not trying to play one sector off against another. What I'm suggesting is that you as developers understand the hazards, you as insurers understand the hazards, and if you're into the finance market, you also understand the hazards, because if you do, collectively and between you, you can all benefit, and it becomes a win-win-win situation. So on that note, the next slide, please. I just leave you with this picture of the Chakuchu Chola that was badly damaged in 2019, I think it was. 3 small-scale hydropower schemes, total of 26 megawatts, destroyed in 20 minutes, just from heavy rain. And this lady's whole business was predicated on this road that you can see the remains of in the foreground, and you can see that road goes nowhere. And the fact that she's holding her head in her hands just gives you an idea of the social despair that comes from these hazards. It's not just about money, it's not just about concrete, it's not just about power, it's the communities as well. And on that note, thank you very much for your attention.